I just gave my first presentation not too long ago. But I do have updates because I've been going out to my sites, whereas before I was just doing pilot data and stuff. So I can share with you some of the stories that I've heard from the people I've interviewed. And here's what I'll do today, a recap so you remember what my project is about, then some preliminary results, and then some questions and challenges that I'm facing right now. So just a quick recap, asthma affects 14% of kids under 18 nationally, but in San Francisco it's as high as 23%, and that's because, well, it's higher in cities in general, so, it's to be expected, but that's a lot of kids. There are a lot of triggers in child care centers. The main ones are like curtains and carpets that can house pet dander. If one kid has a pet at home and then comes to school, he's bringing all of those allergens to school. So there are like some schools in Sweden, for example, where they've tried even saying like no one who has a pet is allowed to attend this school because, or they have like separate entrances and they make the kids change clothes and things because like it really can be a problem for kids who have that allergy, and it's one of the most common allergies that can trigger asthma. In general, child care staff receive little training or support to prevent and manage asthma exacerbations. There have been studies showing that they generally don't feel that prepared, and they want to receive more training. And then I'll move from behind the podium. There have also been some studies showing that interventions in child care can be successful, but there are few rigorous studies to show that. So, for my project, the San Francisco Department of Public Health requested that I try to answer these two questions. How prepared are child care centers in San Francisco to prevent and manage asthma exacerbations? And which characteristics of child care centers are associated with better asthma preparedness? So, basically the Department of Public Health, the Maternal, Child, and Adolescent Health Division where I'm working, they kind of knew intuitively that asthma was a problem, but they didn't know how much of a problem is it at the center on a day-to-day basis, and how many kids actually are affected, and do the kids have asthma action plans on site and things like that. So I'm kind of like a consultant going in to say well, this is what we think, how bad the problem is, and this is what we're going to recommend that steps that you take. And we're using the National Asthma Education and Prevention Program guidelines that are specifically for child care. So now I have preliminary results because I visited 13 centers out of a total of 40 that I'm aiming for. And those centers cared for 601 children altogether. They're in 7 different zip codes, which has been cool to see very different areas of the cities. And based on the manager report, not looking through the official school records or child care records, there are 7 children per site who have breathing problems. And for that, it's I say, how many kids at your site have breathing trouble or breathing problems? And then I prompt them I want you to think about kids who don't have it, even including kids who don't have a diagnosis of asthma from a child care provider. So trying to get at are there kids who struggle with breathing but may not have been diagnosed yet at the center? And then per manager report, there's 5 children per site with a diagnosis of asthma from a healthcare provider. And there's between 50 and 60 kids on average at each site. And so that's kind of the rate we would expect, just under 10%. So that makes sense. Okay, so is asthma a problem at these centers? So we ask how many children use asthma medication at school more than 2 times per week because of asthma, and that's trying to get at are there kids who have poorly or not well controlled or very poorly controlled asthma based on those NAEPP expert panel report that came out in 2007. And on average, I don't have standard deviations or anything because this is just descriptive statistics that I put together for this venue. So on average, the managers say that 1.2 children, or one child per site uses asthma medication at school more than 2 times per week. So out of the 5 kids per site at the center who have a diagnosis, there's usually 1 kid who has not well controlled or poorly controlled asthma. I was very curious to know, like, how often do the kids who have asthma have to sit out of activities because they're having trouble, because that's another indicator for not well or poorly controlled asthma. And it seems like it's not very common, 0.2 kids per site out of those 5 kids who have asthma. But I think part of the reason it's low is because parents will keep their child home from school if it seems like the child is having an exacerbation. And so I think there may be quite a few days where the kids are just staying home, and so the managers don't, have the opportunity to see them having a flare. And same with the medication. I mean, I think like kids are staying home, and therefore the managers don't have to give medication on those days, even if the kid is having a flare. So we're missing some information. And then I kind of just asked the question in 2 different ways. I asked number of children and then number of times in the last 30 days. And they're kind of similar. Like, there's maybe 1 kid per month who needs to get medication at school, or less than that the kid will have to sit out of an activity. Okay, so then I asked the child care manager, how much of a problem do you think asthma is at this center? And on average, they say, I think it's a 2 out of 5. So they don't see it as that much of a problem, despite the fact that there are a lot of kids who have a diagnosis. It seems like either because the asthma is well controlled or because the parent will keep the kid at home. It's not really like on the top of their list in terms of things that they worry about as a child care manager. I'd be curious to ask them, like, what is your number 1 concern as a child care manager? I don't know what they would say. But then, so that makes it seem like, oh, it's not really an issue for them. But then you hear stories of individual kids at the centers who have asthma that is not well controlled, and then you start to think maybe this is a problem. I mean, we know it's a problem for some kids. So one manager tells this story. He kept the nebulizer, 1 child who had a diagnosis of asthma, he kept the nebulizer here for the whole year. He was using it at the beginning regularly, maybe once a week, but he had his pump as well. So coming in, he would do a couple of puffs of his pump, and that usually kept him okay. But when he would do too much running or too much vigorous play, we would see him laboring. And then when he had breathing trouble, the child care staff would telephone his grandma, who was his primary caretaker, and the grandmother would say, okay, put him on the machine and I'll be right up. As we were doing it, she would come in, she would finish it out, take him home, let him rest, and give it to him again. So here you see, like, for some kids, I mean, he has to have his nebulizer at school. He has to do, like, multiple puffs of the medicine even to get through the school day, or, like, every day. I mean, there are kids who really are suffering from this, and it's impacting his ability to, like, exercise and learn in his child care center and stuff, and probably, he's not able to sleep, etc. So I think even though the child care managers may not see it as a big problem, we can kind of go through the child care managers to find those kids who are struggling and then intervene in that way. Okay, so next I look around to get a measure for asthma preparedness, and there are multiple things that go into this. I mentioned we look at asthma action plans. Oh yeah, cockroaches. So we look at asthma action plans, we look at medications that are on site, and if there's spacer and mask, because kids under 5 need to use a mask to get the medicine in. And then we also look around, like, how many triggers are there at the child care center itself. And I don't know what I was expecting before I visited, but, like, there are a lot of triggers. I mean, more than half the sites with carpets, curtains, which these are, like, huge repositories for dust, non-washable stuffed animals, upholstered furnishings and things. Bleach. So bleach used to be recommended by child care centers, like Title 22 is the thing that oversees licensing. and they would say, oh, you have to use bleach like after every meal, and you have to leave it on for this certain amount of time. But the DPH now is switching over to recommending non-bleach because bleach was shown to be an asthmagen. So not only does it like exacerbate asthma in kids who have a diagnosis, but it can actually lead to the development of asthma. And so their DPH is trying really hard to get away from it, but it is expensive to have these alternate cleaning products. So many sites still just use bleach. Other aerosolized products and air freshener, those are common things, and the aerosolized products, because they're so small, they get down like far into the lungs, and it can be a big problem. And then yeah, we found 4 sites. I didn't see cockroaches, but the managers report to me, yeah, we've had cockroaches in the last year, we've had mold. So there are triggers. But the fact that the kids aren't really having exacerbations at school makes me think like, well, if we are gonna propose an intervention to the DPH, I'm not sure that like proposing a trigger intervention would necessarily be like the most cost-effective approach for them. Oh, and here are pictures that I've taken at the center. So on this one, you see that there's like air freshener, which it's just, you know, you don't want to go around spraying air freshener when there's a bunch of kids with asthma. But the thing is, like, if they're in old buildings, if they're in old buildings and like the ventilation isn't working, then it can start to be smelly, and so they try to cover the smells with air freshener. So that's like a pretty common problem that we see. Or this like aerosolized disinfectant is the other one.
Is the ventilation not working like an independent factor for having kids have the asthma exacerbation?
I haven't seen any studies on that. I mean, for kids having exacerbations, if it's like stuffy in the room, and then you're saying independently of stuff being sprayed.
Yeah, maybe like even if whether or not you sprayed the stuff, maybe just having no ventilation it will cause kids.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so, because there's always like odors, or there's fumes from the like art project materials that they're using. So if those fumes aren't taken away, then it is going to be a problem for those kids. And then I guess this didn't turn out very well, but a lot of centers have these like boxes that the kids go into, and then these are pillows, and they don't have washable covers on them, and so the kids like go so the kids like go in, and then they're totally covered in, these pillows are totally covered in dust, and so yeah, if there is a kid with asthma, that is not an ideal situation. But in general, the sites, like, they know what things harbor asthma triggers, and they try to avoid those. Like, I don't see many stuffed animals anymore. I see like sometimes terry cloth ones, or ones that don't have the thick fur, because I think sites realize that like it can be a problem. So the next thing to go will be these pillow boxes. Okay, asthma preparedness. So then, yeah, like I said, I asked about, are they aware that the DPH is there to give them asthma trainings? Do they receive asthma trainings? And most of the sites have not within the last 1 year. Do they have written policies, and do they want to receive more training? And so that's been interesting. We asked about smoking. Most of the sites do say, because they're in the city, like, yeah, we do smell tobacco smoke at our center, even though they have a smoke-free policy, and that's not good for kids with asthma, particularly because a lot of these kids have parents at home who are smoking, so it would be nice if there were a place where they could go to be away from that trigger. Some sites offer smoking cessation resources, which is recommended by a lot of national asthma organizations, but many don't know that that would be a good thing to do. And this quote is about the same child, actually, who had the nebulizer at school. So the manager says, last year, that child who had a lot of difficulties, I had to have a meeting with the parent and grandparent because both of them smoked, and they would sit in the car and smoke with the child in there. So I told them that definitely had an impact. And then they had to go through that smoking handbook that we had, and we kind of went through there to talk about the toxins and the cigarettes. They stopped smoking in the car. They would go across the street and smoke. They even stopped smoking in the house. And what we noticed is it started clearing up a little bit more. He wasn't having as many attacks. And the grandmother thanked us for that information. I think empowering parents with information helps them make a more educated decision. So that's great. This is a child care manager who is really on top of it, and she, you know, had the training or just general knowledge to, you know, sit down with the parents and talk to them about smoking and how it can trigger asthma. And I mean, it can be hard to think like, well, like how do people not know that smoking could be a trigger for their child's asthma if they're like smoking in the house? But you know, like that's part of why we're doing this assessment, because clearly there are things that we're assuming that people know that they don't know, and so this way we can go out and like do an intervention specifically about how to talk to parents about smoking. And then we ask about asthma attitudes, like how confident are you, how familiar are you to care for a child who has asthma. And for these, we're going to later correlate these with overall asthma preparedness based on all of those different parameters that we find at the centers. And then asthma and physical activity is mentioned in the national guidelines that I'm using, and it's something that I'm particularly interested in, but I couldn't find really a good way to get at it, short of like sitting at the center, watching the kids do physical activity, and like waiting for a kid to have an asthma exacerbation, which would take forever. So I just asked them, how much do you agree that children with a diagnosis of asthma can participate in physical activities in the same way as children without asthma? And in general, the managers say, oh yeah, I agree. Kids with a diagnosis, as long as they're not having an exacerbation, then they should be able to participate normally. But then, okay, this is the last, or second to last story. But then when you talk to them, not all of them, but some of the managers, they say, I asked, what is the best example of a way that you encourage them to participate? And they say, like, I would pay attention to Samuel. He has asthma. When I see him red or sweaty and running, doing more physical activity, then I would suggest him to take a little rest. Not breathing trouble, I just don't want him. When you get really tired, it's not really good for asthma. 45 minutes, he's still doing really active activity, and there's hot weather, then I will tell him to calm down. So this is, you know, it's not just this one manager, this is like a recurring theme that I've heard. Like, there was another manager who says, well, I have asthma myself, so I know that it's okay to do physical activity as long as you, like, don't push yourself past your limit, and, you know, you have someone watching the child in case he needs the medication. But he says his staff will say to him, like, oh, that child has asthma, and then to the child, why don't you go sit over there instead of playing? So I think it is like a pervasive problem, and there is a link between asthma and overweight and obesity. Like, it's not, obesity is a risk factor for having asthma, but there is some like bidirectionality. So I think having asthma could also predispose you to becoming overweight. So, you know, possible intervention would be like, maybe we need to do a specific session about like taking care of kids with asthma and making sure that they can still participate in all the physical activities that everyone else can. Okay, so my last slides are just questions and challenges. So the way that my project is because it's a collaboration with the DPH, I won't have all of the data that the nurses are collecting about like medication and asthma action plans until probably June, and this year ends in July. So that's one challenge that I kind of had a sense that this would happen, but I'll have some of the data before that, but that's one thing where I'm like, well, maybe there will be like pieces that I can still use, or I'll just continue the project until like through my 4th year, which is also fine. Next challenge that I'm facing, I feel like the managers' responses are not always like entirely 100% truthful. Like, I ask questions about, oh, do you have written policies and guidelines for dealing with an asthma exacerbation. And a lot of times they just say, oh yeah. And then I'm like, really? I don't quite believe that. But, but you can't say that. And so I don't know how to take that into account later on when I'm doing my preparedness score calculation. And then kind of similarly, I asked how prepared are you to administer medications, and then how prepared are staff to administer medications. And I think when I ask about staff, they tend to kind of overestimate the staff's abilities and staff's comfort with caring for children with asthma, because I have a staff interview that is very similar to the manager interview. And I was doing my staff interview in the pilot data, and then my pilot visits, and then it was just taking so long to do both interviews that I stopped doing it. But now I'm kind of I wish I was still doing the staff interview, because I think I'd be getting very different responses than what I'm getting now. So that might skew the results a little bit. So my summary slide, I think asthma is a significant public health issue. I showed a bunch of slides last time about kids in the 0 to 4 age group going to the emergency department at much higher rates, and so it is a big problem in my age group. I think child care centers could play a much larger role in prevention and management than they're playing now. I gave that smoking example. And I think also that there may be many opportunities to intervene in child care centers, but one of the most important for us, given the obesity epidemic these days, would be asthma and physical activity, and trying to get providers more comfortable with kids who have asthma being active. Okay, thank you everyone.
Questions for Chelsea?
Do you think that you might get different results if you had a mechanism like SurveyMonkey or something where people could answer these questions anonymously and not just the chalk in interview, but other people, all of the staff members at a place? I don't know if that's even.
Oh.
I don't know. I mean, because I think you hit on an interesting point about people maybe not being forthright. That would be a possibility ever.
Yeah. Well, I think there was a very similar study where they just focused on attitudes, and they did either a SurveyMonkey or a mailed survey, and that's where it showed that staff really don't feel prepared at all. And yeah, because that was for staff, not just managers.
I see.
Yeah.
So it was different when staff answered it.
Yeah, it was in Canada, but that's okay. Yeah. So, and that's just one component of my larger study. But I agree. I think I would get very different answers. Even if I did the manager interview via SurveyMonkey, and they felt more like it was anonymous, I think I would get different answers maybe then too, because a lot of managers just say, "Oh yeah, I'm a 5."
Right. Of course.
Okay. The other thing that kind of confounds it is I say oh, I'm a UCSM medical student and I work at the DPH, and then they're like, oh my god, you work at the DPH. But they like the DPH. They really like the nurses at the DPH and stuff, so I think it's, I don't know.
They might get a little scared.
Yeah, I think they might get nervous sometimes, so just do what you can.
Kind of a broader question. I imagine, from your study, you'll come up with some recommendations to remove some of the allergens in these centers, and my knowledge of asthma and allergies would be limited. But I wonder, I do know about the hygiene hypothesis, and how how when you remove a lot of early, things that can stimulate people to have allergies, and that can predispose them to have allergies or asthma in the future. And so I wonder, how do those two things work together?
I think that's a very good question, and it's something that people have not quite figured out. But I think the hygiene hypothesis, from what I understand, it's more keeping things hyper clean, where you're spraying well, they do kind of spray bleach all over, but you're you won't even let the kid go out and play in the dirt or anything. Whereas for this, like, I don't think anyone would argue that getting cockroaches out of centers is a bad thing, or removing mold from centers would be a bad thing. And there have been a lot of quality studies showing that kids who grow up in homes like substandard housing, they are much more likely to develop asthma, and then it's linked to like cockroaches and mold and smoking, things like that. So, but yeah, I think like this whole rise of allergic diseases, those are the two conflicting hypotheses, and I get parents asking me this all the time, like, oh well, I've heard about this hygiene hypothesis that like we shouldn't be keeping our houses clean. So now I've just started explaining it like there are two hypotheses. One says things are too clean. The other says things are too dirty. And we don't really know what causes asthma, but it probably, like, depending on the situation, it could be either of those.
Chelsea, regarding your descriptive statistics, I was wondering if you could, you have your episodes per site. I'm wondering if you can, if you were thinking about doing it as a reflection of the time, like a time component and also a number component, so then you can compare it easily. For example, take into consideration how many kids are in presiding over what period of time. So like almost like a person-year observation.
Yeah.
Then I can compare it better. Like, I'm sure you can easily get that.
Yeah.
Even if you ask per year, then you can have per child year observed how many attacks, etc.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because then you can get a better population estimate of be more. But hard work, a lot of hard work. And my second question is, there's so much overlap with asthma and allergies. So I know this is a little bit too late, but I can remember if you got any qualitative data with people bringing up allergies too as an issue with some of the sites where there was a lot of carpeting or anything. I know you didn't specifically ask, but the reason why I thought about that is because if you're seeing low outcomes with asthma-related, there probably are a lot more outcomes with allergies, and that might have an impact on quality of life and things like that too.
Yeah, no, we don't really ask about allergies. I mean, I ask like how many kids have breathing problems in general, and then sometimes they'll say, oh, we have this kid who has is allergic to everything.
But that could be a second thing in the future.
Yeah.
If that ever comes up qualitatively, as a reason for cutting back in some of those asthma triggers.
Yeah, they're so related, and kids who have allergy are much more likely to have asthma anyway, so anything we do for asthma would probably help the allergy kids too. Yeah.
Thanks.